Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of video interviews. Today I'm joined by alumna and honorary graduate Lindsey Hilsum. Lindsey is international editor for Channel 4 News and has covered many of the conflicts of recent years, including in Syria, Ukraine and the Arab Spring. She was on the ground in Baghdad during the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and in Belgrade at the start of the 1999 NATO bombing. And in 1994, she was the only English-speaking correspondent in Rwanda at the start of the genocide. As well as being an award-winning journalist, Lindsey's also an author, and her second book, The Life Story of War Correspondent Marie Colvin, was a Sunday Times Book of the Year. But more recently, Lindsey's been reporting on the COVID crisis around the world, including from some of the worst-hit communities in Italy and Brazil. So thanks so much for joining me, Lindsey.
It's a pleasure to be here.
If I can just ask you about some of your more recent work, I mean, you're just back from Brazil. What's it been like traveling and reporting during a pandemic? I mean, we've seen you in full hazmat suits and all sorts.
Look, Brazil was absolutely fascinating, and I was going out of my mind, stuck at home, putting together, news agency footage and making phone calls and doing everything from home. That's not journalism. Journalism is getting out there and being an eyewitness and talking to people and seeing what's going on with your own eyes. So when Brazil came up as a possibility, I just knew that was where I wanted to be, because Brazil, as the pandemic seemed to be leveling out, certainly in Europe, in Brazil it was just getting worse and worse. And that was mainly for political reasons, because President Bolsonaro just refuses to take it seriously. And so that was fascinating. The political story was fascinating. We were very lucky in that we were able to get into the favelas, the shanty towns, with NGOs and with, other community leaders, and find out, how difficult it is for people in those poor communities. They're very aware of COVID-19, but how can you socially distance when the alleyways between homes are less than a meter wide, and when people are, living on top of each other? Yeah. And one of the things which will stick with me from that, I met a lovely woman called Eleni. Eleni lived in a favela in Sao Paulo, and she had 5 children. She was bringing them up on her own. She was a cleaner, and she said, "Oh, the lady I was cleaning for dismissed me at the beginning of the pandemic because she was worried I would infect her children." But actually, it was the other way around, because COVID-19 came to Brazil through wealthy people who had visited Europe and brought it back. And so they were the ones who were likely to infect their cleaners rather than the other way around. And you only really get to learn about that kind of thing if you're there on the ground. So that was the great privilege and excitement of being in Brazil.
Brilliant. I mean, like you say, you've been on the ground in various different countries recently. I mean, what's your sense of how people are coping in these different places, or not coping, perhaps?
Well, you look, it varies from place to place. So you compare the favelas of Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, as I've just described, with Bergamo in Italy, where I was. Now, it's a very wealthy part of Italy, but it was terribly badly hit, and it's still not completely understood why. But I went to the cemetery in Nembro. Nembro is one of 2 villages where it was the worst, possibly the worst in Europe, and just the utter sadness there. We're talking about a small village of maybe 11,000 people, and everybody has lost a family member or a neighbor. And this is a place where, it's a wealthy place, it's prosperous. People don't expect to find adversity in the same way as the people of the favelas of Brazil are used to it. It happens every day. Every day is a struggle. In Bergamo, every day is not a struggle. And so I suppose I felt that a lot of the coping at this point was about, dealing with that, dealing with sorrow, dealing with grief. And now I understand that some of the people we spoke to are going to sue the local authorities because grief has now turned to anger and feeling that this should not have happened. And it was the responsibility of local authorities who failed to lock down in time.
Wow, that's interesting. I wonder if that'll happen here as well.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, because I felt there's a lot of what had happened in northern Italy had happened here 2 weeks later. Certainly the progress of the virus was like that, and certainly the mistakes like the locking down too late, they were all the same, so I wouldn't be at all surprised. if there were court cases here as well.
Yeah. And just rewinding a little bit, just before the crisis hit, you were reporting on further fighting that had been taking place in northern Syria, and that's not the first war zone you've reported on. I mean, do you ever get scared reporting in situations like that?
Of course, if you didn't get scared, you'd be an idiot, wouldn't you? Of course, anybody in a war zone who never gets scared is, situationally unaware. They're not taking it seriously. So yes, of course I get scared, but then you calculate risk. You decide. So, for example, we were at the end of last year, we were in the Kurdish part of Syria, and just after the Turks invaded. And we were with a convoy of Kurdish people, soldiers and civilians who were going to the front line. They said they were going to fight, they were going to be human shields and stop the Turks coming in. Now, this was insane. This was an insane thing to do. And so we went with them and we filmed with them to a certain point, and then we didn't go any further, because the chances of them being attacked by the Turks from across the border was very high. And sure enough, they were attacked. And some of those people I met were killed. Now, yes, I was scared, and my team as well, but we weren't really scared. We just knew that it was not a good idea to go any further.
Yeah.
So we didn't do that. So you have to calculate risk. Of course, you don't always get it right. And of course, things happen. I mean, Marie Colvin, you mentioned, I wrote her book. She was killed by a mortar fired by the Syrian government into Babarama, a besieged suburb of Homs, where she was reporting in February 2012. So yes, I've lost quite a few friends. But fear is one of the useful things that you have to prevent your own death.
Yeah, wow. I mean, one of the other things you've reported on, as well as war zone, you've reported from some other pretty horrific situations, genocide. Again, another report just from the other week was reports of torture in Zimbabwe. I mean, how do you manage to stay objective in situations like that, where most of us, I think, would probably struggle to report?
What do you mean by objective?
Well, sort of neutral, I suppose. I mean, not
neutral. I'm not neutral. I'm not neutral about people being tortured. It's wrong and it's bad. And my job as a journalist is to point it out, to find out all the details, to be accurate, to get the eyewitnesses, if possible, to get the perpetrators, though that's always, more difficult. And to tell the story of what happened. I'm trying to find the truth. I'm not going to say, on the one hand, it's a bad idea to torture people, but on the other hand, maybe no, that's not my job. There were three, last time I was in Zimbabwe, last year, we came across all these young people, mainly young men, who had been badly beaten by the police. And, and so we did that story, and we showed the wounds all over them. They'd been whipped. They had terrible wounds. Now, I'm not, I don't think that objectivity is about being neutral about that. Objectivity is saying what happened and trying to find out why. I do think it's important to try and talk to perpetrators as much as you can, to get what the government says, what the police say, to try and, get some kind of statement from whatever. But I am not equidistant when it comes to things like that. Of course not.
No, and I mean, I guess maybe some people, well, not maybe not neutral, but I guess sometimes I think certainly I would get far too emotional to be able to report on things like that, probably.
Well, emotion is an interesting thing, because I think that if you don't have an emotional response when you see, outrages which have harmed and killed people, then you're not a human being. And if you're not a human being, you can't be a good journalist. So I think that emotion is a perfectly reasonable response. You see child refugees, and if your heart doesn't, feel that, then why are you there? Why bother? Go and do something else, be an accountant. But you also have to have an ability to say, okay, and this is terrible. Who, what, when, where, and why? why did this happen? Who did it? Who are these people? And sometimes, of course, you have to be careful, because sometimes, atrocities are staged and they didn't really happen. And then I think you get, and, it's done to get, sympathy. And I think that I'm not saying that I always get everything right, because I certainly don't. But I think that sometimes you do, with experience, get a bit of a nose for when you're being, led down the garden path, and you get, when things are real and when things are not real,
Okay.
on the whole. But part of, your journalistic technique is to find out what happened, not just stand there and cry about it. You can do that later when you're by yourself.
And do you feel a responsibility to share people's stories in this sort of situation?
Of course, that's my job. That's what journalists do, to share people's stories, to, cast a light, to, tell people what's going on in the world. Of course, that's my job. That's my responsibility.
Excellent. I'm not sure everyone kind of feels like that sometimes. I mean, thinking about all these stories, is there anything that's stuck with you more than anything else over the years?
Look, a lot of things stick with you and you never quite know why. I was in Aleppo, and I can't even tell you what year it was, maybe 2014, and there were these people who'd been displaced from place to place to place, and they were living in these half-built apartment blocks. So it was like a doll's house, which had the front taken off, though there never had been a front. They were on these floors, and there were two little girls, Kauthar and Thaura, and the older one could count to 10 in English, and the younger one could count to 10 in Arabic, and that was it, because they had been taken out of school. The older one, I think, was 10, the younger one was 6. And I looked at these little girls, and they were so desperate to show me what they had learnt, that they knew these things, and they wanted to do it on camera. So we did it on camera, and I broadcast it on camera, because you say responsibility to tell their stories. That's what those little girls knew. And yet I know that they would probably not get back to school, and they would probably end up marrying, at 14, 15 or whatever. And their lives were unlikely to turn out well. And I found the following year, when I was in Europe, when all the refugees were coming across from Turkey and going up through Europe, all the time I was looking for them. I was looking for those two little girls. Of course, I never saw them, and I will never find out what happened to them. But a little bit of me never stops looking.
Yeah. Wow. Now, I just want to change the subject a little bit, because at the moment it feels like there's quite a lot of animosity towards journalists and journalism, particularly, in America, where there's fake news, lamestream media, enemies of the people, all sorts of phrases get bandied about. And we've even seen journalists attacked live on air by the police during the recent protests. So what's it like operating in that kind of environment? I mean, are you worried about continued freedom of the press, or is it something that just seems worse to us than maybe it really is?
Well, no, look, I think it's very serious, and I was horrified by the attacks by the police on journalists doing their job in America, reporting protests and unrest. I mean, it was horrific. You get used to hostility from governments that don't want you to find out what's going on. And I'm like any other journalist. I've been arrested, I've been held by the police, I've had to hide from the police. You all of that stuff that's just par for the course. That's normal. But this hostility against journalists, and the online hostility, I think is extremely worrying. And particularly when you see it in America, and you hear what Donald Trump says, because that sets a tone. I think it's important to understand that the journalists who are at risk are always the people in their own countries. So, Mexican journalists in Mexico, the Syrian journalists in Syria, much more than foreign correspondents like myself who go in and out. We go in and out, and then we come back to our nice, safe home.
Yeah.
Sometimes that goes wrong, as with Marie, or with, journalists who were kidnapped in the time of ISIS and so on. But the broader hostility, and the hostility that, members of the public often seem to have now, which they didn't before, which I do think is top down, is because of what leaders have said. I find that extremely worrying, and it goes hand in hand with a generation, who get their news from random online sources, and don't really know, what is credible and what is not credible, because they have no context. And so, in a sense, certainly when it comes to Europe and America, I think that teaching news literacy in schools is one of the most important things, that people understand what journalists do, and that a journalist making a mistake, getting something wrong, is totally different from, these wild conspiracy theories out there. I think it's a very difficult, complex, systemic, long-term problem.
And do you think that's something that can only really change from the top? If things change at the top.
Now, cancer, and it's spread throughout. So it has to change from the top. I think I think that, I hate to mention Donald Trump all the time, but him and, Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, these leaders definitely, spread this narrative all the time. But it is there now. It's there in amongst people. And therefore, I think that the way to change it is in a sense from the bottom, and that is in primary schools. And that's why I think that teaching news literacy and understanding the difference between a journalistic story and a conspiracy theory, I think it's an essential skill for people to have, and it has to be taught from very early on.
Brilliant. And I've just got a couple more questions. I mean, given everything you've seen in humanity over the years, reporting all over the world, I mean, do you feel a sense of positivity about the future and things changing, or do you just kind of look at us all and despair at what's going on?
There's a sort of there's a philosophical and political way of looking at things, and then there's your own psychology. And so I think that philosophically and politically, I look at the situation in the world, and it's hard to be very positive. I think that there's a lot of difficult things going on at the moment. I think there is a latent fascism which is growing. I think we have to fight it. I think we have to fight what we've just been talking about. This doing down of truth, and this multiplication of paranoid conspiracy theories. All of this stuff I think is very damaging. But I think maybe I'm lucky in that psychologically I think I'm quite an optimistic person. And one of the things that you find when you go to the worst places in the world is that you find the best people in the world. You get a lot of hope from the extraordinary things that that people do. During the genocide in Rwanda, people who didn't kill their neighbors but saved their neighbors, often in great peril themselves. And similarly in Syria, my friend Wad al-Khatib, who was a young student who just picked up a camera and started to film what was going on, and then ended up making a documentary which was nominated for an Oscar. And this was so interesting. She and her husband, they had children. They said, stuff this, we're not going to let this horrendous situation stop us from creating our own family and our own happiness. And they had these two children in these crazy, difficult circumstances. So when you come across people like that, and I think that that's what gives you, or at least gives me, hope.
Brilliant, thank you. And just one final question. I mean, when I used to work at the NCTJ, and I used to talk to a lot of young people who wanted to be investigative journalists or foreign correspondents. They wanted to go around the world and find all the kind of secret stories and shine a light on stuff. That's obviously not a particularly easy area of journalism to get into. I just wondered if you have any kind of insight or advice from your own career path for people like that.
Look, it's difficult because, I started out a long time ago. I'm quite a lot older, and the whole media industry has changed, and it's changed for the better and worse. I mean, better in the sense that there's a lot more outlets now because of online. There's an endless demand for news and information, but does anybody want to pay you for it? That's a different thing. So making a career out of it is very, very difficult. I suppose I would say that I'm not a big fan of undergraduate journalism courses.
Okay.
I don't think that they're particularly useful. I think it's better to learn a language or to do a specialism. If you're any good at science, there's always a shortage of science journalists and environmental journalists. And I think that environmental journalism is the new war correspondent. That's the new front line.
Right.
So I think that that is a really serious and important thing to do. And if you want to do that, you have to know what you're talking about. You have to get your science degree.
Yeah.
I think that if you are a person who's, has done history or politics or language or whatever, these days, a postgraduate degree in journalism is useful, although I know it costs money. I certainly never did one. I know it costs a lot of money and it's difficult, but, to do that. But those courses, the good courses, quite often do have tentacles into the industry, and that's helpful. And I suppose the other thing I would say is, I went and worked for an NGO. I worked for Oxfam in Guatemala, which was an odd way in, but it worked for me. And then I got a job as a UN volunteer in Kenya as an information officer. So that was my way, and I'm not sure that that's a viable way in anymore. But I do think that you can, if you could, I worked as a waitress to get the money to go and do that. You can find yourself a place that you're interested in and go there. And then, just sort of do stuff for any kind of, specialist publication, Sprockets Monthly, I don't care, just anything, just get writing, do something, and try and find things that other people aren't interested in, like Sprockets. And, and just sort of start to build things up that way. But
Brilliant.
I understand that it's not easy. But I suppose fundamentally, you're not going to get anywhere sitting on your bum. You've just got to get out there somehow or other. You've got to get out there. You've got to have the determination to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Lindsey, for your time today. It's really interesting to talk to you. I hope everyone else has enjoyed listening to us, and we'll be back with more videos very soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.